Let's get more people in here. Folks, can we please sit down? You're ready? We're ready. Anybody else left out in the hallway? What's been really fun about this symposium for me is that I've been able to introduce so many insanely great people, in the words of the late great Steve Jobs. And certainly one of the very topmost of those people is Alan Kay. Most of you identify him with personal computers and personal computing, and at a time when that idea was still embryonic, or as some of us thought, lunatic fringe. He's made seminal contributions to object-oriented programming, graphical user interfaces, and window managers via the Smalltalk language and its programming environment. He's always been interested in the appropriate use of computer technology, and especially in the area that appeals most to me, education. Alan is also, as most of you probably know, a very serious musician, was a professional musician. And I tried to characterize him, first thought of him as a polymath, but many people don't know what that is. So then I thought about interdisciplinary, and Alan didn't like that, so we came up together with calling him, Alan, what was the word? And then we had to fish for that. So trans everything that I know about. Here is Alan to finish up for us.
Thanks. Thank you. We had to use the trans prefix somehow since Ted is here. Well, I thought when I was thinking about what to do for this talk, I thought when I kept on thinking back to the period when I think that Bush was most influential in the ARPA world, and I was thinking that might make a nice talk to just think about the 60s, just to cut it off at the end of 1969. Before it just happened that 1970 is when Xerox PARC started up, so cut it off before Xerox PARC. And when I was thinking back, the more I thought back, the more I thought of some of the interesting people who influenced that very, very interesting and exciting decade. So I thought to start off with a little trip down memory lane, and as a kind of a context for the talk, I thought I'd start off by showing you Arthur Koestler's. Arthur Koestler was a great novelist who, in the last years of his life, became a psychologist doing research in creativity at Stanford. And one of his characterizations of creativity sort of goes as follows. He said that our minds are kind of constrained to think within contexts or within systems of belief. Sometimes they're called paradigms, but he was thinking of something perhaps larger, that we have a set of commonsensical things that we accept as reality, and our thought patterns sort of jog along, staying in this particular, here, a pink plane, every once in a while we have little outlaw thoughts that are regarded as lies by the pink plane, and they're usually just suppressed and pushed back. And every once in a while, when you're taking a shower or out jogging or something, you are relaxed enough to let one of these outlaw thoughts flourish a little bit. And sometimes what you find out is that that little pink idea, when expanded into the blue context, is much more interesting than it was in the pink context. So the idea here is terrific ideas often hide behind good ones. The good ones are the ones that are this is like peer review at NSF. They always fund good research, but they almost never fund great research, because somebody is already, 6 people are trying to decide whether what you're trying to do is reasonable ahead of time. And usually the way it works is you decide whether it was reasonable by looking what happened. So, and then Kessler said, and what happens when you get one of these big blue inspirations? Oh, sorry, did I? Well, I goofed. I left out a slide, so I'll just tell you here. He said there are 3 reactions. If you're telling a joke, then the reaction is ha-ha. If you're doing science, then the reaction is aha. And if you're doing art, then the reaction is ah. Because he points out in each of these cases, for instance, a joke is something that takes you down a garden path and then suddenly reveals that the context you're in is not the one you thought you were in. Science has this aspect as well. You suddenly see it was there all the time, and often, besides saying aha, you start laughing. And of course in art, the whole idea in art is to try and take you out of the world that you're in, your commonplace world, and reveal that there's more to the world. And one of the maxims here is that knowing more than your own field is really helpful in doing this. And I've always thought that one of the reasons the 60s was so interesting is that nobody was a computer scientist back then. And everybody who came into it with lots of other knowledge and interests. And then they tried to figure out what computers were, and the only analogies, the place they had to use for analogies were other areas. And so we got some extremely interesting ideas from that. And of course, the reason being educated is important is simply because you don't have any blue context if you don't have any other kinds of knowledge to think with. So engineering is one of the hardest fields to be creative in, just because it's all about optimizing, and you don't optimize without being very firmly anchored to the context that you're in. So what we're talking about here is something that is not about optimization, but actually in kind of rotating the point of view. Now, I was 5 years old in 1945, and I must have seen the Life magazine article, because I used to peel through Life magazine. But in that age, I was much more interested in the manila envelopes that Life came in, because you could draw in them. So I'm sure that Memex made no impression on me back then. I ran across it when reading a science fiction story by Robert Heinlein in the 50s. And Heinlein had this nice thing of taking terms that he had found out about and making them generic. So he spoke rather casually in the science fiction story of a Memex. And whenever he did that, I had found out that that was a good reason to go to the library and trying to find out what basis Memex had. And that brought me to reading Bush's article in the 50s. And I'm ashamed to say that it, aside from being interesting in the science fiction way, it made nowhere near the impression on me that it did on Doug Engelbart and some other people. It wasn't actually until after I had met Doug Engelbart and had heard him talk that I realized that the ideas of Bush had tremendous significance. But I got that through the eyes and the ideas of Doug Engelbart. So for me, I started off in the very early 60s, 1961, doing data processing for the Air Force. And back then, they didn't really have operating systems. They were very ad hoc. And Air Training Command had many bases, and they had to move files around. And somebody, to this day unknown, I once tried to find out who it was that thought up this idea, had come up with a wonderful notion for allowing data to be used from base to base without having to have lots of standards and formats and operating systems. And the way it worked was this, is that each file on the Burroughs 220 tapes had three sections. The first section was a set of pointers into the second section, which was a set of code, and the code knew about the third section, which was the formats of the data records. So in modern terms, what you have here is a generic interface, a set of methods, and then the data parts of objects. So this is the first example that I know of in which this object-oriented idea is actually used. Of course, it wasn't thought of in those terms back then, but it was something that was used quite a bit in the Air Force until they decided to standardize on COBOL, in which case all of this stuff got thrown out and they went back to processing data. Another thing I saw that didn't make an enormous impression on me, in fact, I should say, the other thing that happened was that the third machine I learned down here in the Air Force was the Burroughs B5000, which I think has 7 of the 10 best software ideas directly in the hardware. And at that time, I only appreciated a couple of them. The fact that it was very easy to compile to was pretty much all I understood about that machine. But it also had something like this technique of being able to deal with state indirectly. You could do all of the things that you're normally used to doing with bits, but without having to know what the bits look like or where they were. I didn't appreciate that at the time. In '65, I was actually helping to debug the Control Data 6600, which is my vote for the first RISC machine. It was about 1965. It was a 10 MIP machine with the kind of instruction set and parallel operations that we associate with RISC machines today. And while I was working on that machine at Seymour Cray's lab, I read this article, first article by Gordon Moore, showing what had been happening in integrated circuits up to 1965. And then up to that point, it had been doubling every year. And so his first cut at it was, what if it kept on doubling every year? And so that was interesting to think about. But from my standpoint, I really couldn't make any extrapolation or jump from this Freon-cooled 6600 that could detect how many people were actually in the room at a given time because of the capacitance on its doors from human beings moving around, to what this might actually mean. Now, a couple of years later, Gordon Moore looked at it a little more closely, looked at the physics of the silicon, and said, well, it probably won't be worse than a factor of 2 every 2 years. So that's that lower, less sloped line. And just for interest, what actually happened from about 1970 on is that magenta line there. So an interesting thing about Moore's law was it was actually a 30-year prediction. And at least the one that he did in 1967 or 68 or so, he was able to bracket successfully what was going to happen exponentially in silicon for about 30 years. Quite a remarkable, almost unbelievable, and I think that most people in the industry that were going to be affected incredibly by it couldn't believe it at all. At the most, they thought it might mean that they would have more margins on their mainframes, but the idea that this might mean millions and millions of computers, I don't think affected anybody at the time, including Gordon Moore. But when I went to University of Utah, sort of by an accident. First person I ran into is Dave Evans, the head of the department, and the "this" that's referred to there was Ivan Sutherland's thesis. He had a stack of these brown theses from Lincoln Labs on his desk, and you had to take one of these and go away and read it before you got a desk. And I must say I didn't really understand Sketchpad very well, but it seemed to be about a system that was not just about making drawings. And that was an idea I hadn't really thought about either back then. But it was also the idea that the drawings generally had meaning, especially in engineering. And what you would really like to do with these, most of the drawings you make in engineering, is to see whether they actually work. So the underlying notion of Sketchpad, in fact, it was conditioned by the fact that the display on the TX2 at Lincoln Lab, which is a machine, by the way, about the size of this room, maybe a little larger. You're just seeing one small part of it. Here, the display was so bad that it had discouraged previous people who had been asked to do computer graphics on it. And the difference here was that Ivan looked at this terrible display and asked the question we should all ask more often, which is, what else can it do? And when he thought about it, he realized that although the pictures were going to be terrible and the drawings done by the plotter were not going to be up to engineering standards, that what else it could do was to simulate. And this is an idea that was not strongly in any of Bush's writings, in spite of the fact that he was one of the developers of early analog computers, which in fact did simulate. And of course he had funded ENIAC, which simulated up to a certain point. But if you look in his writings, you'll see that he thought that certain logical reasoning would eventually be able to be done by computing, and he had some real jumps as far as transcribing speech. But the notion of being able to deal interactively with simulations was not something that was really in his writing. It was something. This was an idea that came about from other people. And I thought, just for the fun of it, to show you the movie, one of the movies made the summer or the late summer of '62. First set of movies made of Sketchpad, and in reviewing this, there's one place on the tape where there's some tape damage. So we'll just ignore that as we go along. Let's roll that first tape. Yeah. So you dip the light pen into the ink, and this rubber band technique Ivan invented. And why they called it Sketchpad is that you could put in something very quickly and loosely and then give it some rules. And here the rules are to be mutually perpendicular. And what you saw there is Sketchpad figuring out how to do that. Now you notice this is the first system ever to have a window. And in fact, the simulated paper that he's drawing on is about 1/3 of a mile on a side, I believe. And again, a couple of lines drawn in quickly and then giving the constraints to make them be perpendicular to the lines that they're terminated on. And now the constraint is collinearity. So he's using these 2 lines he drew as guidelines for these dashes. And now he will tell the guidelines to be invisible. So now he's drawn a hole in this flange. I think this is where the damage shows up, yeah. So now he wants to do a rivet. It'll clear up in a second. Sorry. Or maybe it won't. So he's using the center of the crossbars there as the center of the circle. And again, he's saying, let's make these guys mutually perpendicular. Well, that changes the crossbars, and that changes the circle, so you get a nice symmetric rivet. In fact, Sketchpad could solve some very interesting nonlinear problems. That bridge that you saw on the slide, you could draw bridges in, give the rules for stresses and strain of beams, and it would calculate how much stress and strain there would be for given weights hung from the bridge. You could draw on electric circuit elements, put in Ohm's law, and so forth. So now what he's going to do is make some rivets for his drawing here. So the way the controls here, he's using one hand with the light pen, and on the other hand he has some switches for commands for different constraints, and he also has some knobs that he's turning. So you can see this system led to an interest in better displays. It's actually not even a line drawing display, it's putting up each dot individually. And in fact, there's a kind of a twinkling pattern that's put up there. So he says, oh, I forgot there's these cross bars on the rivets, so I'll go to the master drawing and I'll get rid of those guys. And lo and behold, we see that these rivets here were actually instances. So Sketchpad was really the world's first object-oriented system. And he really had pretty much of all of the paraphernalia of object-oriented programming. And now he's made a flange with a rivet in it, and he can use anything that he makes as a master. So now he's making instances of the flange with a rivet and positioning them and scaling them and so forth. So once asked Ivan, how could you possibly... Okay, stop the tape. That's enough. So I once asked Ivan, how could you possibly have invented computer graphics, the world's first object-oriented software system, and as you can see, one of the very first dynamic problem solvers that could do both linear and nonlinear problems? And Ivan said, well, I didn't know it was hard. And in fact, if you read his thesis, Bob, do you know, did it ever get published out in the world? No. This is, besides still being great today, I mean, it's really saying something to be able to read something that is interesting today, that you can actually learn something from it by reading it today and comparing it with what's going on. What is really interesting is the diffident and even apologetic tone in Sketchpad, because it didn't do more. So Ivan's, and this is, I think, is true of most of the people that I think of as the great people in the 60s, is that they really wanted it all. So the image of what Sketchpad should do went far beyond what it was able to do, although when we look at it today, we are just awestruck by what he was willing to take on just from scratch and what he was able to accomplish. Well, right after that, I found my desk, and they had a tradition at Utah that the latest graduate student got the latest dirty task. And actually, I was graduate student number 7, so there are actually quite a few dirty tasks left for people to do. And there's a pile of listings and tapes on the desk that was supposed to be the algol for the campus computer. It turned out to be the first Simula system. And the documentation was quite incomprehensible. And finally, another graduate student and I unrolled the listings for it down the hall of Merrill Engineering Building, some 80 feet long or so. And he crawled on it on one part of the listing, and I crawled. Imagine doing this on a display today. It was very useful that he could crawl over it down there, and I was crawling over it down here, reading the machine code, trying to figure out what the thing did. And we finally realized that it was allocating storage exactly the way Sketchpad did. In fact, it was kind of a programming language version of the same kind of internal model that Sketchpad had. And the good news was it was easier to do. Sketchpad couldn't solve every problem you posed to it, so it had a limited range of things it could do, but it did those very elegantly. Simula was a generalized programming language, and so you could pretty much do anything that you could write programs for, but none of it was particularly elegant. And now, in my checkered past was a degree in molecular biology, and this book had come out in 1965. This visit to Utah started 1966 or so, and I had read this book by Watson. And one of the neat things he did in this book, this book is still in print, but in a current edition. The first edition of this, I think, was the first book that ever tried to do an assay of living things. So the favorite animal that molecular biologists looked at then was E. coli, which is a bacterium we have in our gut by the millions, helps us digest certain kinds of food. And by that time, they were able to tell us that about 70% of E. coli were water and small charged molecules, which actually were, of course, important for the reactions that were going on there, but didn't interact informationally. But there are about 120 million organic components that interact informationally. That is mostly enzymes, proteins of various kinds, and DNA and so forth. And if you work out what these are in terms of representing them on a computer in a fairly compact way, it's about 100 gigabytes of stuff going on. And so I wrote down there it's about 50,000 2-megabyte desktops worth in an E. coli. And one of the things to think about here is how fast the reactions are actually going on. At the temperature 37 degrees centigrade, which is pretty much what your body temperature is inside of you, these medium-sized protein molecules, those little white things that look like popcorn there, are able to move their own length in about 2 nanoseconds. So now people, when they take chemistry in high school, most chemistry teachers actually don't understand why chemistry works, and they will shy away from any questions from students asking just how can atoms and molecules find each other in order to have these reactions. And the answer is that the thermal agitation at that level of scale is unbelievably violent. I'll give you an example. If a carbon atom is about the size of a tennis ball, then one of these protein molecules is about the size of a Volkswagen. So on our scale, if you can imagine a Volkswagen made out of tennis balls moving from here its own length in 2 nanoseconds, and if you multiply that out, you'll see that that is a scale speed that's faster than the speed of light. So if we were actually transported down in size to being able to look at what an E. coli is doing at normal body temperature, we would be stunned by the violence. In fact, we could not see anything that's going on. It's just unbelievably violent, and that is why biology and chemistry actually works. Something is very hard to get into people's intuition. Well, so that is a very complex and interesting structure, and it happens to be 1/500th the size of a typical cell in our body, and we happen to have between 10 trillion and 100 trillion of these cells in our body, and yet 50 cell divisions are all it takes to grow a baby. Now think of taking something much, much simpler like a 747 that Lee Sproul she was talking about a 777, and imagine what you have to do to make it 6 inches longer. Right, the manuals for it are bigger than the plane, if they were listed out. I'm sure they're on CD-ROMs now. And yet a baby gets 6 inches longer about 10 times in its life, and you never have to take it down for maintenance. So what we have here is something that is a kind of informational machinery that is just in a different league than computers are even today. And certainly, if you look at the number of components in animal cells and think of how many we have. The other thing about them is that they're dying all the time. And not only that, they're actually exchanging their structure. So another interesting thing that I knew from molecular biology is that no atom in our body stays in our body for more than 7 years. And in fact, more than 90% of the atoms in our body are recycled every 2 weeks. So if you think about this is really quite startling. If you think of yourself as actually a pattern moving through time and space, sucking up energy and material, and reformulating it to be yourself. And yet every 7 years, you have not a single atom, not even in your bones, that you had 7 years before. So this is a completely different way of thinking about things, and things are going wrong all the time, but in structures like this, more things are going right. Well, something about Simula got me thinking about computing. That the reason I suddenly realized that computers were tiny, tiny, tiny little simple things. They were not the big, physically they were big, but compared to biology they were nothing. Hardly anything was going on, and the only reason programming worked on them was because people were hardly doing anything. And what came to my mind, it was kind of like making a doghouse, which unless you make it out of toothpicks, you can make a doghouse out of almost anything, because the structure is so simple compared to the strength of the materials. It's only when you go to big things that you have to really introduce architectures to make them work. And it suddenly leapt into my mind that all of the programming that I'd known how to do in the 60s was nothing, even though it seemed hard to do. But compared to what the actual potential for building structures was, we were going to have to shift to a different way of doing it. So I had one of my Arthur Koestler bingos. And the bingo was that the computers are not like the clocks they seem to be, where the clock, if anything goes wrong, it stops. And a clock is something you fix, and a clock is something you build. But in a biological organism, you don't fix them, you negotiate with them. And you don't build them, you grow them. And so this notion of why shouldn't we be building everything on the computer out of self-healing, intercommunicating parts, the way biology had. And so this was very compelling to me, because of course one of the reasons why cells are a good idea is that nature is very, very messy about doing biochemistry, and requires, there's enormous numbers of, for anybody who's discovered it, you might know that there are hundreds of reactions just to move electrons around. And the reason is that the energy margins are so small, and that there was no grand designer figuring out how to move these electrons along. Nature found out how gradually, but biochemistry is very kludgy, and it requires stable conditions. So what the cell did was allow this kludgery to continue in a protected way. Because nature rarely undoes things. It basically adds on more kinds of things. And this is a way of taking messy things that sort of worked and guaranteeing that they would work better. And then eventually, of course, these cells found out how to work together. And now looking back again at Simula, what Simula was almost one of these things. And they had been thinking about simulating oil refineries. And the thing that I got out of it is, gee, why not simulate programmatic things? Let's get rid of data structures entirely. We'll simulate those. We can simulate servers on a network. In fact, these kinds of systems are kind of like servers on a network. We can simulate control structures. We can simulate physical objects. We can simulate biology. In fact, simulation, again, thinking about what Sketchpad was about, is one of the dominant metaphors that is in the destiny of the computer. And there's one thing you can do with a computer that biology doesn't do well, and that is you can share the DNA. Biology does it by copying the DNA, and so when you want to replace something, it is really a complex operation. People are discovering how to do that now for cystic fibrosis. In the computer, you can actually share the DNA by extracting it and having all the cells look to a master copy. This is very powerful because it gives you meta control over what the system actually is all about. So that was my first revelation. Came in the end of '66, and a little bit later Dave Evans got me a consulting job with a guy by the name of Ed Cheadle, who wanted to build a little computer for engineers. And eventually we wound up building a version of it called the Flex Machine, This is what picture of it on its own display. And while we're just starting, and we knew that it wasn't the first personal computer because Wes Clark and Charlie Molnar had already done one called the Link at Lincoln Labs in the early 60s. And we hadn't thought about this machine until Ed Cheadle wanted to do one, and then we realized that somebody had already done it, and we were able to learn quite a bit what you might try and do on such a small machine. This machine, by the way, was made in some quantity, and a lot of fundamental inventions were done on it, like the things that look like deck tapes there, but deck tapes were actually invented for this machine by Wes Clark. And here's a shadowy figure. Now, this actually isn't a picture of Bob Barton, because as far as I know, his pictures have never shown up on photographs. He was called the ghost who walks because he was seen outside of Merrill Engineering Building, and he was seen inside of Merrill Engineering Building, but he was never seen entering or leaving. Suddenly he would be there, and then just as suddenly he would not be there. He was the guy who designed the Burroughs B5000, and I think was the greatest computer designer who has ever lived. And his influence in his own inimitable way had a lot to do with how this little machine of Cheadle's and mine executed. We made it execute directly one of the earliest object-oriented languages. And you see one of his famous sayings up there: systems programmers are high priests of a low cult. So his idea was if you have to have an operating system, then you might be designing wrong. And we realized that if you had an object-oriented system, that you really didn't have to have an operating system, because it actually would supply all of the things you normally associate with an operating system all by itself. And so as I said, Sketchpad had the first Windows, and the first multiple window system I know of was Sketchpad 3 that was done by Timothy Johnson. Showed you different views of a three-dimensional object. And so we needed to have a windowing system. This was done at the same time as Ivan Sutherland and Bob Sproul at Harvard. We came up with a clipping divider idea that was rather similar to, I think, Danny Cohen's algorithm, multiple views and so forth. Now, right as we were working on this stuff, we were visited by Doug Engelbart. And Doug, I'm sure you remember, but when you traveled around back then, you used to travel with, you didn't travel light. He used to travel with a 16mm, this is before video and stuff, so he traveled with a 16mm projector and a film. And the reason he traveled with his own projector, he'd had it modified so he could do stop frame. And the reason he did that is that people were not used to looking at cursors. And a lot of what he wanted people to see was what people did with the cursors on the screen. And as I recall, the movie on that one was a green display, because I think what you showed back then was the 3100, or the control data single user version of NLS. Because my memory has it being in color, and it was green. So I think it was that system that was shown. So this was the visit that actually changed our life. Certainly changed my life, because what Engelbart brought was not just a vision of interacting with a system, but he had a philosophical underpinning. And that philosophical underpinning is as important today, maybe more important today even than it was then. One of the phrases that he used that I particularly liked, and I'm not sure I still understand it, but on the other hand, when you're listening to this stuff, it's total understanding is not necessary. But his phrase was thought vectors and concept space. And what he meant, I think, was that what you're doing is creating an extension of the kinds of spaces that you think in terms of inside of your head. So it's actually, you're creating an augmentation of the ways of thinking and the ways of representing and the ways of associating that was now going to be extended in a way somewhat analogous to the way writing is extended us, but something more like the way we actually think. and that what we're really interested in is, in particularly, the collisions of different kinds of ideas. So if you think of Kessler's diagram there, you can see that one of the things that you would like to do for maximum creativity and getting out of your rut is to constantly have the system help you see different sides to things, to remind you that you're in a context and that there are other contexts. But anyway, such was the his talk was so fantastic that, like all really good talks, I think everybody came away from that realizing that this was an actual turning point in the history of design for computer science. I think all of us were very interested in trying to do something with that. I'm not going to show you the movie because you saw it yesterday of the 1968 demonstration in San Francisco. Those of us who were there, I was sick as a dog, but I went anyway. I had strep throat and maybe pneumonia, but I wasn't going to miss it for the world. And it still sticks in my mind as one of the greatest expositions of a new set of ideas that I've ever seen. I think everybody who was there remembers it, and there were a lot of people there. There must have been somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people witnessing that. Actually, I remember that was where I met Andy Van Dam, and for those of you who've only known Andy in the last 20 years or so, I want to reveal to you that in 1968, Andy was a hippie. He had long hair and at the very least a goatee, if not more, and he was a wonderful, angry young man at that point. I remember him being both tremendously impressed with the Engelbart system and amazed that it actually did what it did. That was my impression of Andy back then. Right around this time, I visited Ivan Sutherland at Harvard and met Bob Sproul. Bob Sproul then was an undergraduate who was simultaneously graduating from Harvard, I believe editor of the yearbook, but he spent almost 24 hours a day helping to wire up the clipping divider for this first head-mounted display machine. And I understand that he's slowed down quite a bit. He only works 20 hours a day now instead of 23 and a half. Now, just one little plug here for why all this stuff worked. I think these are the most enlightened funders that we know of in this half century, and I haven't heard Licklider's name mentioned too much today, although Lee mentioned it. A lot of this was because of his understanding, personality, and vision. And the succession of the ARPA funders during this golden age, before it became DARPA, were Licklider, Ivan Sutherland when he was only 26, Taylor, who later went on to be the founder of the computer stuff at Xerox PARC, and Larry Roberts. So and their basic idea was to fund people instead of projects, one of the great ideas of all time, and fund directions instead of goals. I don't think anybody else would have funded Engelbart in those days, because I believe he must have appeared to most people, in fact I know he appeared to most people as somebody who was completely deranged and out of his mind. And it's a real pity that the ARPA funding from the 60s didn't carry over into the 70s, or I think history would have been quite different today. Because sometimes the people who can see the farthest and see the deepest are the ones that are most difficult for the bean counters to understand. So I met Marvin back then. Marvin gave, it's a typical Marvin comment, like to say you don't understand anything if you only understand it one way. And he gave a talk on education and mentioned some of the stuff he'd been doing with Seymour Papert. And the talk was so interesting, I read his book. My other major was in mathematics. So I found in this book, besides a lot of finite automata stuff, some really interesting ways of thinking about universal computing. Not just Turing machines, but Marvin did a very funny thing of when he was explaining Gödel numbers and how Gödel made a kind of a list structure out of exponents of factorizations of integers. Marvin built an entire Lisp system in one of the chapters in this book using that as the representation. That was a really weird way of learning Lisp, but it got me interested in this way of thinking about things. And let's show the next little film. Then I went to Rand Corporation. This is still in '68. And I saw this system. Yep, go ahead and run it. It's got sound.
First we erase a flow arrow, then move the connector out of the way so that we may draw a box in its place.
Sees he wants a box and makes one for him. Now it's recognizing as printing.
The printing in the box is being used as commentary only in this case. The box is slightly too large, so we may change its size.
That's where modern-day window control came from, literally.
Then draw a flow from the connector to the box. Attach a decision element to the box and draw a flow from it to scan. We then erase the flow arrows attached to the process post new area and move the box to a new position. This allows us to draw a new box.
Okay. Now you may have seen character recognition done worse on some products today. Partly because it's, as Roger was saying, is that they weren't trying to do the 80-20. This was an 80-20 thing where it did what it did essentially perfectly, almost perfectly. You had to learn a little bit. It did what it did, and there are a bunch of things that it wouldn't do. But the result of it was that the character recognition part on this particular interface, which the system is called the Grail system, the character recognition was almost foolproof and very, very transparent in the user interface. And there were some further advances done at Harvard and elsewhere on doing this. And this really struck me as a very, I thought of as a kind of an intimate way of interacting with the computer. And then just a little bit after that, a couple of weeks after that, I visited Seymour Papert for the first time out here in Lexington and saw his work with children. And that was another one. See, for me, the 60s was pretty much a continual series of holy shits, just one after the other. It was almost over, and I think it's, you know, part of it is the golden nostalgia, I'm sure, from old farts, but also I think actually this stuff is still pretty neat even today. I think the Grail system was neat. I think Sketchpad was neat. I think NLS was really neat. It was really a joy to learn NLS and have a sense of what it could mean to be a virtuoso in dealing with your external representations. So Papert had another profound idea, and that was that whatever the computer was, it wasn't really a tool or even a vehicle in the sense of being an automobile as compared to IBM's railroads. But Papert thought of it as being a medium for powerful ideas. Now, Nicholas was hedging on the definition of a medium. I like Neil Postman's definition. Neil Postman says technology is a machinery, like the printing press is a machine, the computer is a machine. And he says media are the purposes to which we put that machinery. So for him, the media on the printing press are things like Bibles, indulgences, money, comic books, romance novels, pornography, political essays, scientific essays. So there's a wide range of media that is all printed, all represented, all brought forth by the same piece of technology. So if you think of media as purposeful aims, you see the strongest things that Ivan Sutherland and Doug Engelbart and some of these other people did were actually creating media. And I didn't realize that until I saw Seymour working with the kids. And he realized that there's only one way of thinking about this to me, and that was it was a kind of medium being brought forth from machinery, and it was going to be very much like the printing press. So flying back to Utah, I sketched this thing, which I later made a cardboard model of, which later became called the Dynabook. And it was hollow, filled it up with lead pellets to see how heavy you could make it before people didn't want to carry it anymore. And the result was about 2 pounds. So we had this notion that if you're going to have an intimate medium, then you'd have to do mundane things, casual things on it. So we asked the question, what would it be like to take a grocery list and actually put it on a computer and actually carry it into the grocery store and be willing to carry it out with 2 bags of groceries? What kind of computer would that have to be? Okay, and one of the things that was happening in the end of the 60s was that ARPA had been doing the ARPANET, but Larry Roberts and some of the other people who were, Bob Kahn and other people who were driving the ARPANET were also thinking of packet radio back then. So in '69, I remember driving around, I think it was a Ford van with a Model 33 teletype in the back and all kinds of radio equipment communicating with, I think it was actually Engelbart's computer at SRI, by radio at 10 characters a second on this Model 33 teletype. So there's a whole sense that that computing was going to get to be mobile, and I think many of you may know that Larry Roberts' last set of things that he was interested in doing were to have a handheld radio terminal that would be portable and would connect you through packet radio to the ARPANET. So and the other thing is I actually tried to get the picture here, but Lee, I'm sorry, we actually were thinking of this thing being networked, because I think networking was part of the ARPA dream. And the first cartoon I ever did of this machine, I'll show you later, shows 2 kids playing Space War with each other, each on their own Dynabook, communicating by radio. So just having these ideas here led to something kind of interesting, and that is, it struck me that having a time-sharing graphics terminal, this desktop computer that Cheadle and I have been working on, and this cardboard model reminded me of something that had already happened hundreds of years before, and that was the development of printing. So on the far left is a manuscript book chained to its little desk. If you've ever been in a medieval library, they have one still in Florence. They're the size of this room, or maybe twice the size of this room, but they only have about 70 or 80 books. One of the largest libraries in Europe in 1400 was the Vatican Library. It had 372 books. The richest man in France, who was the brother of the king, was a bibliophile and had books made for him. He had 154 when he died in 1435. So these books cost the equivalent of millions of dollars, and they are so rare that only institutions could afford them. In 1454, at the Nuremberg Book Fair, Gutenberg showed 20 Bibles, and people marveled at 2 things. One is how alike the Bibles were to each other. That was really new. You could look at one page, and it looked just like the same page on another Bible. They'd never seen that before. And the other thing was that the cost had come way down. These Bibles only cost 3 years of a clerk's wages, maybe $60,000 today. And so you could think of those as being workstations, kind of things that institutions, smaller institutions in towns and some individuals could own. And you notice that the Gutenberg Bible was illuminated because they made every effort to make it look like the manuscript books on the left. And then 50 years later, to me, is when printing actually happened, and you have books that instead of being this size are now this size. These are printed by Aldus, whose last name was not PageMaker. His name was Aldus Manutius, but he's the person that the Aldus Corporation took their name from. And he was a Venetian printer who had been a scholar, and he went out and decided books should be this size because he went out and measured saddlebags in Venice, because the first offering from his printing press in 1495 was called the Portable Library. And instead of printing just one book, one kind of book, the Bible, Aldus over the next 35 years, printed 40,000 different titles. He and his sons went around and gathered up all of the writing that the Greeks and the Romans had done that they could find. They printed each one of them, and many of the fonts that we have today were invented by Aldus in order to make this stuff more readable. Aldus is also the inventor of something quite unusual, and that is page numbers. Page numbers went into books the first time ever 65 years after the invention of the printing press. So they went in 1516, and we know why. They did not go in there for sequencing, because the way sequencing was done was to print the word on the next page down on the last line so you could see how the pages went together. It did not go in there in order to refer to other books, because there were no really standard editions of books. Each press run was 2,000 to 5,000 copies. Page numbers went in there partly at the instigation of Erasmus, and they went in there because they were just starting to write down arguments that were so complicated that they wanted to refer people back to what they had said previously. So the first page numbering systems were done in order to, if you will, hyperlink a piece of text within itself. So as you were following along an argument sequentially, the author could say, and as I said back on page 162, blah, blah, and you could go back there and check it out. So page numbers came in as people started realizing that the reproducibility of the books allowed for much more complicated arguments to put in there and not be garbled by somebody who was trying to copy the book by hand. And this led in turn to this idea of trying to link the arguments closer together. This is a very interesting sidelight. And given that it took 65 years to happen from the invention of the printing press, I also use it as a kind of a metaphor for what we haven't thought of yet. Right? Because clearly we are somewhere between the desktop computer and this Dynabook kind of machine, and it's sobering to realize that nothing in the history of printing counted in those 50 years. It was a complete transitional stage where almost everybody was looking backwards. And if we look at the way most people use computers today, it's really pathetic, because most people do not do hyperlinking. Most people do not use computers the way Engelbart thought they should be used, and most people do not use computers the way Ivan Sutherland thought they should be used. What most people are doing is imitating paper, either in prose or imitating paper in terms of accounting. And that echoes all the way back to Sumerian times, because as far as anybody can tell, the invention of writing itself came about first to account for the king's wine jars, and then a few hundred years after that they realized they could also write down some of their poetry. So what's been going on in computing has been very, very, as McLuhan once said, we're driving faster and faster into the future, but steering only by looking through the rearview mirror. And I think that's been going on. And when we can think of a corner being turned into the actual modern era. I just gave a talk in Korea whose title was "The Computer Revolution Hasn't Happened Yet." And I would say that it hasn't happened yet until people start using the computer for dealing with thought vectors in concept space and dealing with the idea that you can have active dynamic models of the things you're trying to represent. So that led to a kind of a sense that there were three different religions, and we didn't know very much about what the right-hand religion was going to be, but we could see that there was certainly a mainframe religion of which Tom Watson Jr. was the Pope, that there was going to be a desktop revolution and religion because Moore's Law said that was going to happen, and then we had this more mythical notion of pervasively networked systems with computers that were kind of like clothing. So one of the last characters I'm going to mention here is Butler Lamson, who talked even faster back in the 60s than he does today, and he once came to actually a meeting on the ARPANET standards and gave a talk on capability operating systems, of which he had been working on one at Berkeley, and what had happened is the meeting went later and later and later, and finally Butler said, well, I have a plane I have to catch. And they said, when do you have to leave? And he says, I have to leave in about 15 minutes. And they said, well, would you like to wait until next time to give your talk? He says, oh, no, I'll give my talk right now. And he got up and gave an hour talk in 15 minutes on capability operating systems, and it was one of the clearest talks I've ever heard. And part of the idea here is something that is part and parcel of objects, which is, but in this kind of operating system, you think of clients and services. The services tend to be generic, like printing and searching and updating and viewing and delegating. And the clients are different kinds of objects. Well, objects in this sense are usually large things. They're like the size of Unix processes. But they have certain things that they can do that are as generic as possible. There are a variety of these kinds of things, and then each one of these clients of the services has a different set of privileges. And the way it's usually implemented is by adding a little bitmap to a protected pointer that says which of these privileges you have access to. So this is a very compelling way of thinking about, and in my mind, what I was thinking about was, gee, everything should be an object. And so the question is, how could you implement this kind of protection, which seemed very, very useful and necessary even for ordinary programming? How could you do it in a fine-grained way? And that leads to this notion of designing in terms of concepts, that you think of behavioral concepts and transmit it into object-oriented terms. You think of having different kinds of things, different classes of things, different types of things, but you're trying to design everything in terms of these generic concepts. And what you wind up with is something that if you can limit the number of concepts that you're dealing with, then your design tasks become much, much easier. And finally, we had, although, again, I was only thinking about the middle panel here as opposed to the one on the far left, we realized that the ARPANET would actually need objects for sure, because networking, particularly pervasive networking, means heterogeneity. And when you have heterogeneity, you better not require people to have to parse things in order to understand them. You really want to be able to execute them in order to understand them, so that they have their own understanding with them. And we felt that something like objects should actually be adapted for the ARPANET. That was a little bit too early. That was brought up in one of the meetings back there, and it was felt to be a little bit too early. But I think we can see from the state of the Internet today that this is absolutely critical to get out of a data structure-oriented way of doing things, which is kind of like going back to MS-DOS, and trying to get to a situation where the objects that we interact with don't have to be from the same object-oriented language, don't have to have been created on the same kind of machine, but nonetheless can interact and interoperate with each other. And then finally, towards the end of the 60s, I finally went through this half page of code in the Lisp 1.5 Programmer's Manual and realized that McCarthy had actually come up with an incredible way of thinking about what programming should be. Now, he was doing it to prove a different kind of point, and as he says himself, it wasn't his fault that Steve Russell sat down and made it work. But once it did get going, it provided a completely different way of thinking about what it means to implement programming languages. And I started thinking very seriously about what an OOP language would be like if it were set up like Lisp. I think of this as the Maxwell's equations for computers, because everything you can do with a computer and in a high-level form is there on that half page. So it's a very, very interesting thing to spend a Sunday afternoon going through. And I think everybody who has gone through this and understood it, spent those couple of hours to go through it, remembers that time when they suddenly said, oh, wait a minute. Now, it wasn't helped by the fact that this particular rendition in this book has a bug in it. So it has one bug, and that bug can causes an extra couple of hours to be taken until you're quite sure that you understand all of it and that there really is a bug. It turns out there is. And what is the bug? Well, of course, they left out one set of parentheses. Then the last part of the 60s was realizing, and this again I want to say something about Doug Engelbart and NLS. The other part of his project that was so impressive to me as a graduate student was when you visited the Augmentation Research Center at SRI, what you found was kind of the epitome of what a research project should be like. They had lofty goals, lots of committed people. They were willing to do any amount of building their own hardware and software, which they did. They built their own display system, and they built their own I/O devices, and they built most of their software, and they helped modify the operating system in order to make all of this stuff work. And actually, the other thing I should have mentioned, I think everybody noticed yesterday that NLS was kind of zippy as far as response. Wouldn't you like to have your desktop computer be as responsive as that system was, instead of lumbering around trying to bring stuff up? Well, I realized that in order to do a computer for kids, that what we had to do was to build a bunch of them, and this is one of the entries in my notebook back then of what I wanted to build. And at that point, Xerox PARC came along, and we got a chance to try some of these ideas out. Now, to me, the moral of some of this, looking back in the past, is that it is incredible how powerful a new context is, and it's also incredible how stultifying it is after a couple of years. I didn't realize until looking back on this, but I think all of us have had this feeling that the very things that made our ideas work when we're in a context were also the ones that held us up from thinking about other ideas. So these contexts wear out. But we can only think about things in terms of context. When we go to one context to another, we get life for a few years. But then there's a syndrome, which I call the sub-goals becoming the goals, that sets in. Usually the sub-goals are hard enough to require a couple of years' work, and once you've been working on them for a couple of years, they become the goals of the project. And all of a sudden, it's hard to remember why you started the project in the first place. So I think one of the hardest things to do on these large-scale things that require so many different things to be done over so many years is to constantly be able to renew what the actual dream was. And it takes so long to get people to understand what these ideas are. This is one of my favorite slides because it shows hand axes from two prehistoric periods. The one on the left, you might notice that when you chop with it, it chops you, because the place where you grab it on the bottom there is pretty sharp. It's almost as sharp as the top. And then a little bit later, somebody came up with a hand axe that was blunter on the bottom so it wouldn't chop you as much. And according to archaeologists, the period of time between these two was about 200,000 years. So you can imagine every generation, probably somebody sitting around a campfire chopping with one of these things on the left said, "Geez, this is hurting. You know, I'll just chip this away," and probably got burnt at the stake for going against the traditions of the tribe, which are probably something puritanical like work is good for you, and it hurts, but, and so forth. And then finally, probably by an accident, some chieftain of some tribe came up with the blunter end one and made it a rule that everybody should have blunt end ones, and that's how this change happened. So there's this low-pass filter to reality, and the biggest example of it is what's happened to personal computing since 1980. The low-pass filter has been so dominant that all we get is about a 60-cycle hum from most of these ideas from the 60s. Look at what most people are doing with personal computers. They have unbelievable resources. Engelbart's SDS 940 had 192K, and it ran 20 users as a time-sharing system with 192K. We've got megabytes. The system is much less responsive than it is. The user interface is worse than it was. And humankind has set down for one of these 20-year slumbers right now bedazzled by stuff that isn't very good. So last slide is a metaphor for this whole talk, and that is something that was actually found out about frogs at MIT here, and that is that frogs don't know what their food looks like. So if you take their normal food, which are flies, paralyze them with a little chloroform and put the flies out in front of the frog will not eat them. The frog will just starve to death. But if you flip a piece of cardboard at the frog, it will try and eat it every time, because what it thinks food is an oblong thing that is moving. And I think this is a good metaphor for us scientists, because the way I think of the flies is that they're ideas. The ideas are in front of us all of the time, and we just can't see them. What we have to do is periodically find a way of realizing that you can't see unless you admit you're blind. And every time we admit we're blind, we can actually see a bit, and then we can push on to the next stage of this grand adventure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alan. We'll take a few questions directed to Alan specifically, and then we're going to arrange for the panel.
Okay. Just want to go back to one of your earlier slides of the doghouse. That I think actually the doghouse is the better model than the bridge. Because if we look at the scale, the bridge is about a middle-sized construction, rather tiny compared to cities and societies which are totally unarchitected, yet somehow work. The thing is, we don't quite understand how they work. I think that's really a challenge for intermittent computing.
But you're making my point. That's the whole point about biology, is that it works in the face of error and not having to be strictly architected.
Okay, then I misunderstood because
No, I said doghouses work simply because they're so simple compared to the strength of material. So that's a different point than the... But the very point I was trying to make about when you go up into real complexity, you have to find a way of getting things to work together even when they don't want to terribly. So the Constitution of the U.S. is a pretty interesting meta program.
And the nice thing is it's small.
It's very, very small, and it's not a set of laws, it's a set of principles for dealing with millions of only semi-cooperative components, namely us. Other questions? Yes.
Not so much a question, but a comment. It seems to me that you focused on the 60s, and it's probably natural to think of the golden age in the area where you get your own awakening and you start to become productive in a creative part of society. But for everybody who's in the field, their golden age is probably going to be some other decade or whatever. As I went back and just sort of picked another one, like the 70s, and just sort of made the list of things that came out there. This was the era when ARPA had a D in front of it. I was thinking of Minsky's adage about not being right about something for too long. I made the list of the things that came out of that decade, and it seems to me they were pretty impressive. The first work on speech understanding in a systematic way started in that decade with Alan Newell's push. The work on image understanding started in that decade. The work, the Internet came out of that decade. The microprocessor was in the decade of the 70s. The personal computer really came out of the decade of the 70s. The work on LANs, radio networks, and VLSI design, the thing that empowered the universities, came out of the 70s. And probably an awful lot of the object-oriented programming work came out of the 70s as well, although you would probably know better than I. So it seems to me it's a little unfair to cite the 60s as the golden age relative to all other ages, because I think it's relative to our own contexts.
Well, I hope I wasn't doing that, because of course the most productive period in my life was in the 70s, not in the 60s. The reason I picked the 60s was that was when I think a lot of these ideas manifested itself in such a way that we could see that they were possible, and a lot of the shoes were dropped in the 70s. But I certainly I think of the 70s much more as engineering. For instance, most of the stuff we did at Xerox PARC was kind of a second engineering pass on things we'd failed at, because the things were bubblegummed together. We didn't completely understand them. So, for instance, one of the dicta that Butler Lamson got us to agree to in the early days of Xerox PARC is we should never do something that isn't engineered for 100 users. And that made us much more conservative than we had been in the 60s, but it also added much more reality to the things that we did. And of course, a lot of the success that we had was because we could make 100 of something, or make a machine that you could run 100 people on, or make software that you could move around. But to me, that was very different than I think of it as being less creative and more engineering than the 60s. But as you say, other people might. Just depends on when you start. From my standpoint, I don't think that it's silly to try and compare one person's gods with another. But I think that to me, Ivan Sutherland and Doug Engelbart did the most towering and important stuff in the last 35 years, and I think that stands up pretty well today. Yes, somebody else was. Okay, great.
Before we go into the panel, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, Paul Penfield has to leave for a memorial service, and I'd like to thank him on our joint behalf for a job very well done. He and a lot of people at MIT, like Ed over there, and Scott, and lots of other people, put in real quality time making this happen. So thank you very much, Paul, and the rest of you. The second thing I have to tell you is Paul has a announcement.
I just want to thank everyone for coming to this. This has been a real wonderful opportunity for me to see some aspects of this community that I hadn't been as familiar with as I should. And I want to personally thank Andy for putting this together. Andy says that we did yeoman job, but I can assure you that Andy, in setting this up over the past several months, has put in far more effort than anyone at MIT has. And I think the whole group deserves to thank Andy for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you know, it was the three guys from EBT who really thought of it, and Lisa who executed it. But I got to invite the speakers. That was the best part. Speaking about speakers, you all know what day it is today? Friday the 13th. Now, I'm not normally a superstitious person. However, I have to find some explanation for what happened. Here's what happened. Inadvertently, Ted Nelson's tape got recorded over. So we do not have an official record of his great speech here. I just found out about this a little time ago. This is not a joke. I'm sorry. I wish it were. And we are trying to find people who may have recorded it. There are a couple of possibilities. There may be some folks out over the M-Bone who recorded it. It's a classic point of failure, and despite all of the duplication that we had in equipment and people, something went wrong. In any case, we asked Ted what he would like to do about it. He was a gentleman to the core and took it exceedingly well. I think I would have gone straight through the ceiling. Fortunately, he's jet-lagged, and so he didn't react quite as strongly as he might have. As I said, he handled it beautifully. We thought, the folks here at MIT thought that what might be fun and interesting is to let him have the last word, as it were, a reprise performance, and any of you are welcome to stay while Ted tries to lay down another track for the historical record. And we'll do that after the panel. Some of you have to go, some of you have other things to do, some of you whatever. You're all more than welcome to sit in on this as Ted tries his best to recapture the moment. We apologize. We'll do another moment, of course. So that's where we are. We're going to take a couple of minutes to set up the chairs for the panel, and then we carry on.